The first rifle shot split the California dawn before the sun had cleared the Pacific horizon. Clean, precise, gone. The sound didn't linger the way most shots do, that rolling echo that bounces off hills and hangs in the air like an accusation. This one arrived and vanished as if it understood that drawing attention to itself would defeat the entire purpose. At Naval Special Warfare Training Facility Coronado, that kind of efficiency was the baseline, the floor, the absolute minimum acceptable standard for the men who trained here. These were not ordinary soldiers. They had been filtered through processes designed to break the merely exceptional and retain only those who existed in a category that didn't have a name yet. They had earned the right to train on this ground through suffering most people couldn't imagine and wouldn't survive. They moved through their morning drills with the synchronized rhythm of men who had done this 10,000 times. Tactical boots raised small dust clouds that caught the early amber light. Brass casings arced through the air in lazy spirals, each one catching the sun for exactly 1 moment before clattering against concrete. Gunpowder smoke hung thick across the firing line, mixing with salt air drifting in from the ocean 2 miles west. This was hallowed ground. Everyone here knew it. Everyone here had bled to reach it. And standing at lane 17, at the far end of the line where the morning shadows hadn't fully retreated yet, was a figure that most of the operators registered, the way you register a piece of furniture in a room you've walked through 100 times. Present, unremarkable, part of the background. She wore the same tactical fatigues as everyone else. Same dark boots worn smooth with use. Same protective eyewear, same ear protection, same chest rig, configured with practiced efficiency. But her collar carried no rank insignia. Her vest bore no name tape. The only identification on her person was a laminated contractor badge clipped to her left shoulder strap, the kind that meant civilian specialist, the kind that said she was here because someone with authority had decided she needed to be here, and beyond that nothing else was your business. When her rifle came up, it settled against her shoulder, the way a door settles into a frame that was built specifically for it. Not forced, not adjusted, just there exactly where it was supposed to be, as if the weapon and the woman had reached some private agreement long before this morning about how they would work together. She fired. The round found the center of the target at 300 meters with the kind of authority that doesn't announce itself. No drama, no ceremony, just physics doing exactly what skill had demanded of it. She fired again. Same result, same authority, same silence afterward. Her name was Maya Reeves. Nobody on that range knew that yet. Nobody on that range knew much of anything about her, which was precisely the way she had planned it, precisely the condition that made everything that was about to happen possible. She had arrived before 0500 while the facility was still running on skeleton staff and the range safety officers were still on their first cups of coffee. She had checked in through the visitor processing center with a documentation that answered exactly 3 questions: who authorized her access, what her clearance level permitted her to observe, and how long she was scheduled to be on site, and generated exactly 0 follow-up inquiries. The paperwork was immaculate in the specific way that certain kinds of paperwork are immaculate, the kind where every blank is filled and every signature is present, and the overall effect is of something so thoroughly in order that examining it further feels like an insult to whoever prepared it. The duty officer had looked at her badge, looked at his manifest, handed her a range safety briefing card, and gone back to his coffee. That was how she entered. That was how it was supposed to work. Before stepping out of the equipment staging area, she had done one thing that nobody noticed. She reached into the interior pocket of her vest and removed a small notebook. The cover was dark green, worn smooth at the corners, the spine slightly cracked from heavy use. She opened it to a fresh page, wrote a single line across the top, and returned it to her pocket. Then she walked out onto the range, took her position at lane 17, and waited for the drills to begin. Standing 60 feet above the range floor in the observation tower, Master Chief Eli Cross brought his binoculars up and found her in the glass. He had spent 26 years in naval special warfare. He had trained more operators than he could count, had watched thousands of men move through these lanes under every condition the instructors could manufacture, and had developed the kind of pattern recognition that comes not from intelligence alone, but from the marriage of intelligence and obsessive attention sustained over decades. He knew what competent shooting looked like. He knew what excellent shooting looked like. He had a precise internal calibration for both. What he was watching through those binoculars existed outside his calibration entirely. She wasn't just accurate. Accuracy was a technical achievement, a product of training and repetition, measurable and replicable. What she was demonstrating was something that accuracy alone couldn't fully explain. It was the quality of someone for whom the act of shooting had long since ceased to be a skill and had become something closer to a language. The way her body absorbed recoil without fighting it. The way her eyes found the next target before her rifle did. The way she existed in each moment of the drill with total presence and zero wasted energy, as if she had evacuated everything from her awareness except the geometry of the problem in front of her. He had seen that quality before in a very small number of people. He lowered the binoculars, keyed his radio. "Command, this is Cross, who cleared the civilian contractor for live fire advanced drills, static." 3 full seconds of it. Then a voice flat and bureaucratic and specifically unhelpful. "That authorization came from above your pay grade, Chief. She's cleared. That's what you need to know." Cross kept his expression neutral. He had been stonewalled before. He knew the particular texture of it, the specific flavor of institutional resistance that meant someone had decided he was on a need-to-know basis and had further decided he didn't need to know. He had learned over 26 years that pushing back against that kind of wall rarely produced useful information and usually produced unnecessary friction. But the stonewalling itself was information. The fact that they wouldn't tell him meant there was something worth not telling. He raised the binoculars again, found her in the glass again, watched her complete the drill sequence with the same unhurried precision, and felt the specific discomfort of a man who has spent decades being certain about what he was looking at, suddenly being uncertain. The morning drills ran for 3 hours. The operators cycled through standing positions, kneeling positions, prone work, transition drills, and stress position shooting exercises, where the point wasn't just to hit targets, but to hit them after your cardiovascular system had been pushed to a state where your hands weren't entirely cooperating with your intentions. The drills were designed to find the ceiling of each man's capability and push against it until something gave. Maya participated in every evolution. She was never the fastest to reach her position. She was never the most visually impressive in terms of the theater of tactical movement, the kind of sharp, aggressive transitions that looked good and occasionally meant something. She moved with an economy that some of the younger operators probably read as slowness, as caution, as the careful movement of someone who wasn't entirely sure of themselves. They were misreading her completely. She wasn't moving slowly. She was moving without waste. Those are different things. The distance between them is the distance between someone who is trying to appear competent and someone who stopped caring about appearances so long ago that the concern has simply ceased to exist. When the rangemaster called the mid-morning break, the operators pulled back to the shade structures at the north end of the range, removing helmets and gloves, their voices rising in the familiar cadences of men who have been operating at high intensity and are now releasing pressure, competition and camaraderie, jokes and war stories. The normal music of a unit that knows itself well. Maya walked to a bench near the equipment shed, sat down, and began field stripping her rifle. Her hands moved through the process the way a pianist's hands move through a piece they've played 1,000 times. No thought required. The mechanism knew itself knew her, and the maintenance happened at a level below conscious decision. While her hands worked, her eyes were moving, not in an obvious way, not in a way that anyone watching would identify as deliberate, but she was watching everything. The way the senior operators carried themselves during the break versus how they had carried themselves on the line. Who deferred to whom in casual conversation? Where the laughter came from, and who was laughing, and who was watching the laughter without participating. She was reading the room. She had been reading it since 0500. In the mess hall at midday, she took a corner table alone, ate quickly and efficiently, and listened. 2 tables away, in a conversation conducted at a volume its participants probably thought was private, she heard Sergeant Trent Halverson's voice. Halverson was 29 years old, 3 deployments in, with the particular quality of some young operators who were good enough to know how much they didn't know yet. He sat with 3 teammates back to Maya, apparently absorbed in his meal. "Did you see her groups this morning?" His voice was pitched low, but the mess hall's acoustics were indifferent to people's preferences about being overheard. "The contractor." Another voice. Dismissive. Not hostile, just uninterested. "She shoots fine." "Fine." Halverson said the word like he was examining it and finding it inadequate. "I've been shooting competitively for 6 years. I've got 3 combat deployments. I have never not once seen anyone maintain groups that tight at 300 meters in field conditions with wind and a stress protocol running. So she's a good shot. Plenty of good shots freeze when rounds are coming back." Maybe. Halverson didn't sound convinced. But the way she moves through transitions, the way she clears positions, that's not range training. That's something else entirely. A pause. Then a third voice, more considered. You think she's been downrange, actually operated? I think I don't know what to think, Halverson said. But I know what I saw, and what I saw was someone who has done this before, under conditions we probably don't have clearance to know about. Maya finished her meal, cleaned her tray, and walked out. As she passed Halverson's table, she didn't look at him directly. But in her peripheral vision, she caught the moment he turned the half-second, where his eyes found her back as she moved toward the door. She noted it the way she noted everything. Filed it. Moved on. That evening, after the day's final drills had concluded and the range had gone quiet, Cross went to his office in the training facility's administrative building and pulled up a terminal. He ran her name through the standard personnel database and got exactly what he expected. Reeves Maya A. Contractor. Current assignment, Naval Special Warfare Training, Facility Coronado. Authorization level range access, advanced protocols. Duration 72 hours. That was all. He stared at the screen for a long moment. Then he constructed a second search built around specific skill signatures and movement profiles drawn from advanced qualification records, cross-referenced against administrative dispositions from BUD/S training, classes going back 20 years. He was not looking for Maya Reeves specifically. He was looking for the person whose quality of movement matched something he had seen before in a file that had crossed his desk briefly and then been removed from active circulation. The search returned a result. The file was heavily redacted. Most of what it once contained had been replaced by black bars. But the administrative header was intact. The bureaucratic paperwork that existed before whatever was inside became classified, and that was still readable. Reeves Maya A., date of birth 1982, candidate basic underwater demolition/SEAL training, class 298, assessment period 2004 through 2005. Performance evaluations attached redacted. Final disposition dismissed. Reason code administrative. Cross had been in Naval Special Warfare for 26 years. He had processed dismissals, reviewed dismissals, written dismissals. He knew what administrative dismissals looked like and what they meant, and more importantly, what they were used for when the actual reason wasn't the kind of thing that went into official records cleanly. Administrative meant the organization had decided it wasn't ready for the answer to the question her presence was asking. Administrative meant she hadn't failed. She had been removed. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. In 2005, Maya Reeves had been 23 years old, performing at a level that apparently justified her presence in BUD/S training, and she had been shown the door with language designed to leave no fingerprints. 19 years ago, 19 years during which she had clearly not stopped, had not redirected her energy towards something else, had not accepted the organization's verdict about what she was capable of. She had simply gone somewhere else and kept going. Cross closed the file. He did not flag it, did not send a report, did not mention it to anyone. He told himself that was because he didn't have enough information yet to know what it meant. That was partly true, but it was not the whole truth, and some part of him that had been trained to be honest with himself knew it. He closed the file and went home. The question of what he should have done in 2005 and what that made him followed him out of the building and did not stop following him. Day 2 opened with a temperature inversion off the Pacific that pushed cold marine air across the range and created crosswind conditions that the rangemaster described as ideal for finding out which operators actually knew what they were doing. The protocols included close quarters battle simulations in the shoot house attached to the range complex, tight geometry, mixed targets, scenarios designed to test whether decision-making continued to function when your heart rate was elevated and every instinct in your nervous system was screaming at you to simplify. Maya moved through the CQB sequences with something that Halverson, watching from the observation position, would later try to describe and find he couldn't quite get there with ordinary language. She was not the fastest operator through any door, but she was the only one who never made a wrong call across 6 iterations of the scenario. Every threat engaged, every non-threat cleared. Her decision-making was functioning at a level that suggested it was not subject to the same degradation under stress that everyone else's was. Halverson watched this and felt the thing he'd felt the previous day, but larger now, sharper. He was watching someone who had been somewhere that had done something specific to her, had removed some layer of uncertainty about what she was capable of when things got genuinely difficult. Whatever that place had been, it had answered certain questions definitively. He caught her outside the shoot house after the final iteration. "You've done this before," he said, not a question. She turned and looked at him with an expression that gave him nothing. No confirmation, no denial. Just the steady attention of someone deciding how much of their time a situation was worth. The CQB work, he said. You've done it for real, not here. A long pause. Why does it matter? It doesn't, he said. Not to the drills. I'm just trying to understand what I'm looking at. Something shifted in her expression. Not warmth exactly. The recalibration of an estimate. No, you're not, she said. You're trying to figure out if you should be concerned. She walked away before he could respond. He stood outside the shoot house in the cold marine air and watched her go and thought that she was probably right and that his concern, whatever shape it was taking, was probably already too late to be useful. Ryan Caffrey was 24 years old and 8 months into his assignment to this unit, and he had been operating under a specific kind of pressure since the week he arrived that had nothing to do with the drills. 6 months ago, he had done something that required a different kind of courage than the physical variety. He had written a formal complaint. He had used the correct form, cited the correct regulation, described specific incidents on specific dates involving a senior officer whose name appeared at the top of the unit's chain of command. He had submitted it through the proper channel and waited. 48 hours later, it was gone. Not denied, not reviewed and found insufficient. Gone as if it had never been filed, as if the form and the dates and the specific incidents had been written on water rather than paper. Nobody had said anything to him directly, but something had shifted in the way certain people looked at him, a fractional adjustment in the temperature of the room. When he entered it, the specific coolness of an environment that has registered what you tried to do and made a collective decision about what that means for your place within it. He had told himself to let it go. He had come to work every day since and performed at the level the unit required and had not talked about it with anyone. He watched Maya execute her drill sequences with the flat eyes of someone who had spent 6 months reorganizing his understanding of what was possible in this place. The efficiency she demonstrated, the complete absence of wasted energy, her indifference to whether anyone was watching or approving produced in him a feeling he couldn't quite name. Not admiration exactly, something closer to the feeling of watching someone do a thing you had once believed was impossible and understanding too late that it was only impossible if you accepted the terms of the people telling you so. He was still processing that feeling when the afternoon transition drill began. He moved into her lane, not by accident. He moved with enough force to cause a loss of balance in anyone who wasn't prepared for it. Maya didn't lose her balance. Her weight shifted in a way that absorbed the contact and redistributed it without drama. She didn't stumble. She simply remained standing exactly where she had been before the contact, as if the impact had happened to someone else. Caffrey's expression flickered. He had expected a different result. He wasn't entirely sure now what he had intended to prove or to whom, or whether it had ever been about proof at all, and not simply the need to do something in an environment where everything he had tried to do had disappeared into institutional silence. Maya looked at him, not with anger, with something much quieter. The look of someone who has classified the situation and is now simply confirming the classification is accurate. She reached into her vest, removed the worn green notebook, wrote something, returned it to her pocket. She had not broken her breathing pattern. She had not interrupted her drill timing. She had simply noted what had happened in ink in a notebook that had been waiting for exactly this kind of entry. From the end of the shooting line, Cross had seen all of it. He stood very still for a moment watching Caffrey return to his lane with the expression of a man who had done something and was already uncertain about why. He thought about the file from 2005, about the text that had arrived that morning from a number he didn't recognize, which said only "she's doing her job. Let her do it." He thought about what it meant that he had read that text and made a decision without asking any follow-up questions. The question of whose side he was on had apparently already been settled somewhere below the level of his conscious decision-making. He raised his binoculars, found Maya at lane 17. She was already back in position, still waiting with the patience of someone who has learned that the work comes on its own schedule, and the most useful thing you can do is be ready when it arrives. Across the facility on the administrative side of the base, a door opened. A vehicle pulled into the parking area adjacent to the command building. Heavy boots descended onto gravel and moved with the purposeful cadence of someone who had received a report that displeased them and had decided to handle it personally. Commander Dale Hurst had arrived. He didn't know about the notebook. He didn't know about the cameras. He didn't know about the 14 months that had preceded this morning, or the federal authorization in an interior vest pocket, or the question marks written in green ink beside certain names. He knew only that someone had called to tell him there was a woman on his range making his unit look weak, and he had decided to come fix that. The sound of his boots on the gravel carried across the facility on the morning air, steady and certain, the sound of a man who had never once in 18 years considered the possibility that the ground beneath those boots might not be entirely solid. He was about to. Cross saw him first. That was the thing about 26 years in this world. You develop peripheral awareness that functioned even when you weren't consciously engaged, a kind of background processing that flagged anomalies before your conscious mind had finished forming the question. He was watching the operators cycle through their reset positions when something in his body registered the sound of boots on gravel and identified it as significant before he had turned his head to confirm it. He turned his head. Commander Dale Hurst was moving across the facility's approach road with the stride of a man who had already decided what was going to happen and had come to supervise the execution of that decision. His uniform was immaculate in a way that communicated effort, the kind of press perfection that takes time to achieve and is intended to remind everyone in the vicinity of the distance between their station and yours. His jaw was set. His eyes were moving across the facility with the proprietary assessment of someone conducting an inventory of what belongs to them. Cross stepped down from the observation platform. Not running, moving with the specific kind of deliberate speed that experienced operators use when they need to arrive somewhere before a situation develops, but don't want to signal alarm to everyone watching. He reached Hurst at the edge of the range approach in the narrow corridor between the equipment shed and the entrance to the shooting line where the angle of the morning sun created a shadow that kept them out of direct sight lines from the range floor. Sir, Cross placed himself with precision, not blocking, positioning. We're running the advanced live fire protocol as scheduled. Everything is proceeding within authorized parameters. Hurst barely looked at him. His eyes were already moving past Cross toward the range scanning, searching for what someone had called to tell him about. Who authorized a civilian to run point on live fire drills? His voice was flat, tightly controlled. The register of a man who has decided to be calm about something that is making him the opposite of calm. Command authorized it, sir. Documentation is complete. All proper clearances are in place and on file. Hurst looked at him then. Not the response of a superior officer receiving a satisfactory answer. The expression of a man who has been given technically accurate information and has decided that technical accuracy is beside the point. This is my base. The words had the weight of something said many times before and had always resolved situations in his favor. These are my men, and nobody thought to inform me that we were running these kinds of drills on the advanced course. Cross held the look. In his peripheral vision, he could see Maya at lane 17 moving through a drill sequence with the same unhurried efficiency she had demonstrated for 2.5 days. He knew she was aware of this conversation. He had enough information about her by now to understand that her awareness of her environment was not something that had an off switch. He made a decision, the kind that cost something. Sir, he said, and his voice dropped out of its formal register into something more direct. Man to man, I'm asking you to walk away from this one. The silence between them had physical weight. Hurst went very still, the stillness of someone who has not been addressed this way in a long time and is deciding what to do about it. Excuse me. Whoever called you this morning, whatever they told you, I'm telling you that going out on that range right now is not in your interest. There are things in motion here that I can't fully explain to you yet, but I'm asking you to trust 26 years of my judgment and walk away. Something crossed Hurst's face then. Not the surface anger of a man protecting his territory. Something underneath that older and less composed. The apprehension of a man who already knows below the threshold of his conscious acknowledgement that there is a variable in this situation he doesn't have a file on. That not having the file means he is already behind. He covered it immediately. 18 years of command had given him considerable practice at covering things. But Cross had seen it, and what he had seen told him something important about how this day was going to end, regardless of what either of them did next. Stand aside, Master Chief. Cross held his position for one more second. The length of time that communicates considered compliance rather than automatic compliance that says I heard you. I thought about it and I am choosing to comply because the alternative has consequences. I'm prepared to accept, but you may not be. A small act of honesty dressed as protocol. He stepped aside. His hand found his phone almost without his awareness. He looked at the screen. A message had arrived 7 minutes ago from the number he didn't recognize, the one that had texted him the day before. Stand down, Chief. Let the process work. IG office. He read it twice. Put the phone away. Did not yet allow himself to assemble what it meant in its full dimensions, because assembling it fully would require acknowledging things he was not prepared to acknowledge while Hurst was still walking toward lane 17. He understood enough. The 6 cameras he had identified on the range equipment the previous afternoon and chosen not to report. The stonewalled radio calls. The redacted file from 2005 with its administrative reason code. The notebook moving in and out of Maya's vest for 2.5 days, recording things in green ink with the patience of someone who was not here to observe, but to complete something that had been started a long time ago. Whatever was happening on this range had begun 14 months before Maya set foot on it. This morning was the last page, not the story. He turned back toward the range and watched Hurst walk onto the shooting line, and he thought about the word administrative written in a file 19 years ago, and about the silence that word had purchased, and about all the things that silence had permitted in the years between. The operators felt Hurst before they saw him. That was how command presence worked with someone who had been exercising it as long as Hurst had. It moved ahead of the man like a pressure wave, not loud but felt. Conversations died. Drill movements slowed. Attention shifted in the way attention shifts when something enters an environment that the environment recognizes as significant. Halverson was the first to turn and see him. He tracked Hurst's approach with the expression of someone watching weather develop on the horizon, not panic. Calculation. 3 deployments and 29 years of life experience were enough to recognize the specific shape of a situation that was about to become something other than what it had been. He looked down the line toward lane 17. Maya had not turned. Her rifle was up. She was in mid-drill working through a transition sequence, and if she was aware of the change in the range's atmosphere, nothing in her body communicated it. She completed the transition, engaged the target, lowered the weapon to ready, and only then turned her head slightly to take in what had arrived on her range. Not his range, hers. It had been hers for 2.5 days in the sense that mattered. Hers stopped in the center of the range floor. He let his eyes move across the assembled operators with the inventory assessment of a man accounting for his domain. When his eyes reached lane 17, they stopped. The thing that crossed his face was not anger, not yet. It was the more primitive response that preceded anger in men like this, recognition. The recognition of something that should not be here, something that, by the logic of his world, had no standing to be present in this space, performing at this level in front of men whose respect needed to be distributed in specific ways to maintain the architecture of his authority. He walked toward her. His stride ate up the distance with the long, deliberate movement of someone performing certainty for an audience. Every operator on the range had stopped what they were doing. The rangemaster had gone quiet. The California morning had gone quiet around Hurst's boots on the ground, as if the facility itself was holding its breath. Who authorized a civilian to run point on live fire drills? His voice was loud enough to carry to every operator on the line. That was intentional. This was not a private inquiry. This was a public declaration of what kind of situation this was and what kind of resolution it was going to have. Cross moved to intercept from the edge of the range, kept his voice level. She's been cleared by command, sir. All authorizations are documented and on file. Hurst didn't look at him. I don't care if the authorization came from the Secretary of Defense himself, Cross. This is my base. These are my men. He was close to Maya now. Close enough that the physical space between them had become part of the message. And I want to know why nobody thought it was necessary to inform me that we were running these kinds of drills on the advanced course. The last 3 words landed with precise intent. Everyone on that range understood what these kinds of drills meant. The phrase was doing specific work, carrying a specific payload designed to remind everyone present of the categories Hurst believed structured the world and everyone's place within it. Maya said nothing. Her rifle was at the low ready. Her breathing was steady. Her face was the face of someone who has been trained in environments where showing what you're thinking is a tactical liability, where your expression is a resource you manage with the same deliberation you apply to ammunition and communication. She gave him nothing. Not defiance, not submission, not the social anxiety this kind of public confrontation was designed to produce. Just presence. Still incomplete. Hurst took another step toward her. Close enough now that the distance had become unmistakably about dominance, about the use of physical space to communicate a message. His words were reinforcing from a different angle. At the far end of the line, something moved. Ryan Caffrey had been standing at his position with the tension of someone who is about to make a decision he hasn't quite arrived at yet. He had watched Hurst come onto the range. He had watched the dynamic developing at lane 17. And something in that dynamic was working on the part of him that had spent 6 months searching for a way to resolve his uncertainty about his place in this unit. Aligning himself with the command authority, currently asserting itself, felt in the distorted logic of that anxiety like it might be the thing that finally settled the question. He took a half step forward. Out of his lane, Halverson was 4 feet away. He didn't grab Caffrey's arm, didn't block his path. He simply turned his head, found Caffrey's eyes, and held them. The expression he offered was not a threat. It was closer to warning, but with a specific quality of concern in it, the concern of someone who can see where a path leads and genuinely doesn't want to watch someone he knows walk down it. Caffrey looked from Halverson to lane 17, to Maya standing in front of Hurst with her rifle at her side, to Hurst 3 feet away from her with 18 years of unchallenged authority and no understanding of what he had walked into. He looked back at Halverson. "Don't," Halverson said quietly. One word. Caffrey stepped back into his lane. The unit had chosen, not with a vote, not with a declaration, with silence and position and the invisible physics of where people place their bodies when the moment finally arrives and asks them who they are. Hurst was standing alone in the center of the range with his authority and his certainty, and the growing pressure working on him now below the level of his acknowledgement that something about the geometry of this situation was not what he had been told it would be. "You think you're impressive?" His voice had taken on the quality that came from an audience that wasn't performing back. "I've got operators in this unit who have run more missions than you've had birthdays." Maya said nothing. The silence appeared to affect him more profoundly than any response could have. He let it sit for a moment, then did what men who have weaponized authority for long enough eventually do when the authority alone isn't producing the required result. Women always freeze when things get real. The words were designed to produce a specific reaction. In most environments where Hurst had said things like this, it had worked, because it activated something: embarrassment or anger, or the desperate need to prove the statement wrong, and activated people were easier to manage than still people. Maya did not activate. She remained exactly as still and exactly as present as she had been before the words arrived, as if they had passed through her without finding anything to catch on. Hurst's jaw tightened. "You know what I am?" His voice rose slightly. "I'm a Navy SEAL." He said it the way you say something that is supposed to end the conversation. The credential that contains all other credentials that had, in his experience, always been sufficient to establish the ordering of any room he walked into. The silence that followed was the longest silence Maya had produced since Hurst arrived. She looked at him with an expression that did something he hadn't anticipated. It didn't dismiss him. It assessed him. There was a difference. Dismissal implied the person being dismissed had never been worth engaging. Assessment was what you did when you were deciding what category something belonged to, running information through a classification system and arriving at a result. She had classified him. He could see it in her eyes, though he couldn't read what classification she had arrived at. That uncertainty, the simple fact that she was thinking something he couldn't access, was more destabilizing than anything she could have said out loud. "Nothing to say." His voice had found contempt, now reaching for a final instrument. "Figures." He reached out. His hand moved towards her shoulder with the casual confidence of someone who has used physical contact as punctuation for decades. The shoulder grip, that means sit down, stand down. Know your place, delivered through the body, because the body doesn't require the same accountability as words. His palm was inches from her shoulder. "Don't." The word was quiet, almost conversational. It arrived in the space between his hand and her shoulder and hung there with a weight entirely disproportionate to its size. His hand kept moving. Either he didn't believe she meant it, or he believed the meaning of it didn't matter, or something that lived below the level of conscious decision in the part of him that had never in 18 years encountered a consequence for this kind of action. His palm made contact with her shoulder. What happened next took 5 seconds. Maya's left hand came up in a movement that had no wasted component, no preparatory signal, no telegraphing of intention. It found his wrist at the precise anatomical point where a specific rotation of the joint would send pain signals up his arm before his nervous system had finished registering contact. Her grip rotated. Physics did the rest. The joint lock didn't require strength, it required geometry. The body follows the geometry because it has no choice, because the alternative is structural damage to things that don't repair cleanly, and the body knows this even when the mind hasn't caught up. Commander Dale Hurst's feet left the ground. He had time to register surprise. Not the managed surprise of someone prepared for a possibility they had considered. The absolute total surprise of someone for whom this outcome had never once appeared in any scenario they had imagined. Then gravity completed what geometry had started. He hit the ground face first with the specific finality of something that cannot be walked back, that has happened in front of 24 witnesses and 6 camera systems, in the accumulated weight of 2.5 days of evidence, And that will still have happened in an hour and a week in the official record, already being assembled in a building in Washington by people whose job titles he would never learn. Maya stepped back. Her hands returned to her sides. Her breathing had not changed. She looked down at him, not with triumph, not with anger, with the professional assessment of someone confirming that a threat has been neutralized in cataloging the current state of the environment. 5 seconds. That was all it had taken. Hearst pushed himself to his hands and knees. His face was red from the impact and from the dawning understanding of what had just happened in front of everyone whose respect he had spent 18 years accumulating. His breath came in ragged pulls. The immaculate uniform had made its first contact with California dirt. You just assaulted a commanding officer. He got the words out with the conviction of a man who needs them to be true badly enough that saying them might make them so. Maya's head tilted slightly. The movement of someone recalibrating. You assaulted me, Commander. Her voice was level, not loud, not performing for the audience, and simply accurate, in front of 24 witnesses during a classified federal audit. The last 3 words arrived on the range and changed the shape of everything. Federal audit. 2 operators near the center of the line exchanged a look. Halverson went very still. The stillness of someone who has just had a large number of things simultaneously rearrange themselves into a pattern that makes sense. Cross, standing at the edge of the range, did not move at all. Hearst's expression moved through confusion, recalculation, and the beginning of something that might have been understanding. What did you say? Maya reached into her vest. Her movements were visible and deliberate and slow in the specific way that hands move slowly near weapons, when there are a lot of people watching and everyone's nervous system is elevated. Her fingers found the interior pocket, withdrew a slim black folder. She held it at her side for a moment, letting him look at it, letting him understand that it had been there the entire time through every drill and every meal and every notation in the worn green notebook, through every moment of the past 2.5 days. She placed it on the ground in front of him. Open it, she said. He stared at it. The folder sat in the California dirt between them like a fact that had been waiting patiently for the right moment to announce itself. Then Cross moved. He walked to the nearest equipment post at the edge of the range structure, reached behind the maintenance bracket, bolted to the upper section, and removed a small device. Compact, dark housing, the lens barely visible if you weren't looking for it. He held it for a moment, then he pointed. Not at one thing, he pointed at the post in the southwest corner of the range. Then the bracket above the scoring table, then the housing on the ammunition locker. Then 3 more positions, working his way around the range with the slow, deliberate geography of a man reading a room he has now fully understood. 6 cameras, 3 days of footage. Every operator on the line followed Cross's pointing finger from position to position. The geometry assembled itself in their understanding with the unstoppable logic of something that cannot be made untrue once it has been seen. Hearst's hands were not steady as he reached for the folder. He picked it up, brushed the dirt from the cover with the automatic gesture of a man who keeps things in order. Opened it. The first page was standard OD classification documentation. His eyes moved across it, and whatever color remained in his face began to leave. Whatever he had expected when he drove to this facility this morning, it was not this. Not a federal folder that had his name in it, in a date range that went back 14 months, in a list of incidents documented with the thoroughness of someone who had understood from the beginning that thoroughness was not optional. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, something in his face had changed in a way that was different from everything that had preceded it. The anger and the fear and the calculated performance of authority had all been recognizable as versions of things men do when they feel threatened. This was something else. This was the expression of a man who has reached the end of the particular version of reality he had been living in and is standing at its edge, looking out at what comes next. Maya reached into her vest one more time. She removed the worn green notebook. The operators who had watched her reach for it over 2.5 days, who had cataloged it as a habit or a personal quirk without understanding what it was, now watched her open it with a different quality of attention. She turned to a specific page. Carefully, with the precision of someone who knows exactly where everything is, she separated a single sheet from the notebook's interior and held it. She looked at Caffrey. He was standing in his lane, very still, with the expression of someone who has been waiting for something for 6 months without knowing what form it would take when it arrived. She placed the sheet on top of the folder in Hearst's hands. Hearst looked down at it, read the first line. His expression shifted in a way that was different from everything that had come before. The anger and fear and calculated performance had all been recognizable. This was the expression of a man reading his own name on a document he had believed no longer existed. Caffrey made a sound, not words, the sound of air leaving a body that has been holding it for a very long time. Halverson, 4 feet away, said nothing. He didn't need to. The thing he had tried to do by noticing what others dismissed by placing a hand on Caffrey's shoulder and saying a single word had been done. Its purpose was complete. He looked at Maya standing in front of Hurst with the notebook in her hand and the folder in front of 6 cameras and 24 witnesses on a range, where for 2.5 days she had been the figure nobody had thought to look at twice. He thought about what she had said to him outside the shoot house, about not knowing what she was, but knowing what she had done, knowing she had been somewhere that had answered certain questions definitively. He understood now what those questions were, and he understood in the way that people who have been in difficult places understand things that the answers had cost her something. That 19 years was a long time to carry something towards a morning in Coronado. Across the range at the edge of the facility, where the approach road met the parking area, a vehicle had pulled in quietly during the last 5 minutes. 2 people in civilian clothes with federal identification were walking toward the range entrance. They had been waiting outside for a specific event to occur before entering. The event had occurred. The 2 people in civilian clothes walked onto the range with the unhurried confidence of individuals who had been waiting for precisely this moment and had no need to rush now that it had arrived. They were a man and a woman, both in their 40s, both wearing the specific kind of unremarkable clothing that federal employees wear when they want to communicate that they are not trying to communicate anything. Dark jackets, subdued colors, the kind of presentation designed to be forgotten 5 minutes after you've seen it, which is itself a kind of statement about who you work for and how that work gets done. The man carried a hard-sided case. The woman held a federal identification credential open as she walked, not presenting it to anyone specifically, but making it visible to anyone who needed to see it, which is the way certain kinds of authority announce themselves when they have already done the work of making the announcement necessary. Department of Defense, Inspector General's Office. The operators read the credentials with the particular attention that military people give to identification they have not encountered before in a context they are still processing. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The range had developed its own specific silence over the past several minutes. The silence of a place where something significant has happened, and the full dimensions of it are still assembling themselves in everyone's understanding. Hurst was still on the ground. He had not tried to stand. Whether that was because the fall had taken more out of him than his expression was willing to admit, or because some instinct below conscious decision had told him that standing up would require a plan for what to do next, and he didn't have one, Cross couldn't say. He sat with the folder in one hand and the single sheet from Maya's notebook in the other, and his eyes had the quality of someone reading a document that keeps meaning the same thing no matter how many times they look at it, hoping it will mean something different. The mail agent set his case on the scoring table at the edge of the range, opened it, removed a second folder considerably thicker than the one Maya had produced, the kind that represents not a single document, but a sustained argument built over time supported by evidence accumulated from multiple directions and sources, the kind that arrives at a conclusion so thoroughly that the conclusion has nowhere left to hide. He placed it on the table without ceremony. The female agent walked to where Hurst was sitting and stood over him without crouching down, without adjusting her eyeline to his level. She spoke in the flat informational tone of someone delivering news that has already been fully processed on their end. Commander Dale Hurst, you are hereby relieved of command pending federal review under Title 10 United States Code. You are not under arrest at this time. You are required to surrender your base access credentials and remain available for scheduled interviews beginning Monday morning at 0900. Do you understand what I've just told you? Hurst looked up at her. His expression had traveled a long distance in the past 10 minutes and had arrived somewhere stripped of the architecture that had characterized it for 18 years. The command authority, the territorial anger, the practiced performance of certainty, all of it had been vacated, leaving something underneath that was older and less composed. He said, I understand. 2 words. Flat. The voice of a man who has located the bottom of something and stopped fighting the depth. The processing of Hurst's relief took approximately 20 minutes, and those 20 minutes had a texture that Cross would remember for years afterward. The mail agent spread documents across the scoring table with the systematic efficiency of a man who has performed this procedure enough times that it has lost whatever drama it once possessed and become simply work. Paperwork, the bureaucratic machinery of accountability, which is slow and unglamorous, and which does not care whether the person being processed was a hero once, only whether the record is complete. The California morning light had shifted while they stood there. The sun had climbed to the angle where it came directly across the range floor and found the brass casings from the morning's drills still lying in the dirt, catching the light in small flashes, like something still signaling. The salt air continued its indifferent drift from the Pacific. Somewhere beyond the facility's perimeter, ordinary life was doing ordinary things with the day. Hirsch signed what he was told to sign. He surrendered his base access credentials with the movements of a man performing actions whose meaning he had not yet fully incorporated. At one point, his pen stopped. He was looking at something in the federal folder, open to a specific page, looking at it with the stillness of a man reading his own name in a document he had not written and could not redact. The mail agent waited, said nothing, let the stillness complete itself. Then Hirsch signed. When it was finished, the female agent offered her hand. The gesture was formal rather than warm, the closing protocol of a proceeding rather than the warmth of a conclusion. He took it. He declined the offered assistance, standing with a small movement of his head. That was the last thing about him that looked like the man who had walked onto this range. He walked to the exit alone. His boots on the gravel raised small dust clouds, the same dust that had been raised all morning by men training on the ground he had commanded. The uniform that had been immaculate when he arrived was no longer immaculate. At the gate, he paused for 1 second, his back to everyone, looking at something in the middle distance that nobody else could see. Then he walked through, and the sound of his boots faded, and the morning continued without him. Cross stood at the edge of the range for a moment after Hirsch cleared the gate. The expression on his face was not satisfaction, not relief exactly, something more complicated than either the expression of a man who has watched an outcome arrive that he understands was correct and necessary, and that costs him something nonetheless. Not because he had cared for Hirsch, because he had been standing in this facility for 26 years, and the things that happened here had accumulated in him the way things accumulate in anyone who stays in one place long enough, and even the endings that needed to happen carried weight. He turned from the gate and crossed the range floor toward Maya. Most of the operators had pulled back to the shade, structures, their voices lower than usual, the cadence of their conversation different, the tone of people processing something in real time and not sure yet what the processing is going to produce. Halverson had stayed near the ammunition locker present, without hovering available, without intruding. Cross stopped in front of Maya. She was performing a post-drill function check on her rifle, the procedure she had executed at the end of every session with the same thoroughness. Her hands moved through it with the automatic competence that had characterized everything she had done on this range. And for a moment, Cross simply watched her hands move and felt the full weight of what he knew and what it had taken him too long to do anything with. He was 54 years old. He had spent 26 years in naval special warfare. He had made thousands of decisions in that time, some under conditions that didn't permit reflection, some in circumstances where the right choice wasn't available, and you were selecting among costs. He had made those decisions and lived with them, and had not spent much time until very recently examining the specific category of decision that involved choosing not to act. That category had a cost too. It had just taken him 19 years to see the invoice. "I saw your file," he said, "in 2005, the administrative dismissal. I had access to the record before it was reclassified. I knew what the reason code meant." Her hands continued their movement through the function check. She did not look up immediately. "I know," she said. "I could have said something. There were people I could have gone to. There were channels that existed for exactly that kind of situation." "I know that too," she said. The function check completed. She looked up. Her expression was the expression she had worn throughout, steady, undisclosing, giving nothing that wasn't intentional. But there was something in it now that had not been there before, or that he had not been able to see before. Not anger, not absolution either. Something more considered than both. The look of someone who has carried a weight long enough that they have made a kind of peace with the fact that it exists even if they haven't made peace with why. "The thing I couldn't figure out from the file," she said, "was whether you were someone who knew the difference between institutional loyalty and institutional complicity. The file said you were good at your job and good to the people under your command. It didn't tell me which way you'd go when the two things came into direct conflict." Cross absorbed this. "And now, you told him to walk away," she said, "before anything happened, before you knew how it was going to go. You told him to walk away, and it didn't work, and you stepped aside anyway, and then you showed everyone where the cameras were." "It wasn't enough," he said. 19 years too late isn't enough." "No," she agreed. The word was direct rather than harsh. "It isn't. But it's what was available this morning, and you used it." She paused. That's the only accounting that matters now. He looked at the notebook in her vest. Did you put my name in it? She reached into her vest and removed the worn green notebook. The cover was dark, the corners worn smooth, the spine cracked from years of being carried and used and carried again. She opened it to a page near the back where the handwriting was smaller and the entries were older, and held it so he could see without reading the full contents. His name was there, Eli Cross, and beside it not one of the symbols that appeared beside the operators' names. Not a check or a mark of any kind, a question mark. He looked at it for longer than he intended to. What does it mean? It means I hadn't decided, she said. Everyone else on this range was a known quantity before I arrived. Hurst, Caffrey, the unit's performance history, the complaints that disappeared, the pattern going back 4 years. You were the one the file couldn't fully account for. The one I needed to watch. And the question mark. Still open, she said. Some questions take longer than a morning to answer. She closed the notebook. But this morning helped. She put the notebook back in her vest. Cross stood for a moment in the California morning with the weight of that, with the specific quality of incomplete resolution. That was, he understood, probably the most honest thing she could have given him. He was not absolved. He was not condemned. He was a man with a question mark beside his name, which was exactly what he had earned, and the work of answering it was apparently going to take longer than he had left in this uniform. That seemed right. It seemed like the correct shape of the consequence. One more question, he said. She waited. The work you do, going into places like this, building cases that take 14 months and end in a morning on a range, is it enough? He paused, trying to find the precise form of what he meant. Does it move anything, or does it just document what already happened and leave everything else in place? Maya looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked out past the range, past the facility's perimeter fence, to where the Pacific was visible at the edge of the California morning, enormous and indifferent and ancient. In 2005, she said, an institution told me what it wasn't ready for. They use paperwork to say it, which is what institutions use when they want to say something without being responsible for having said it. She paused. I spent a long time angry about that. And then I spent a longer time understanding that the institution's readiness was not a fixed condition. It was something that could be changed, not quickly, not by announcing you were changing it, by building cases strong enough that the institution's only alternative to being ready was to be accountable for choosing not to be. She turned back to him. Hurst will face a federal review. Caffrey's complaint will be entered into the permanent record. 6 other complaints that disappeared will be recovered and restored. That's 7 people whose accounts of what happened to them will exist in a system that can no longer pretend they don't. That's not everything, but it moves the line. She picked up her rifle and turned toward the range. That's what the work does, she said, walking. It moves the line. Cross watched her take her position at lane 17. Watched her bring the rifle up with the same natural authority with which she had brought it up 2.5 days ago when he had first observed her through his binoculars and found his calibration inadequate to explain what he was seeing. He thought about the question mark, about what she had said this morning helped. He was going to have to figure out what came after that, on his own, without her guidance in whatever time remained to him in this uniform and after it. That was also, he understood, the correct shape of the consequence. Halverson had come to stand beside him without either of them marking the moment it happened. They stood together at the edge of the range and watched Maya settle into her stance, watched the rifle find its position against her shoulder as if it had always belonged exactly there. Who is she? Halverson asked. Not for the first time, but asking it differently now with the context the morning had provided, asking for the thing underneath the biography. Cross thought about the file from 2005, about the administrative reason code in the 19 years that had followed it, about the worn green notebook and the 6 cameras in the 14 months of preparation that had preceded 2.5 days on this range. Someone who decided that being told something was impossible was information about the institution, he said, not information about herself. Halverson was quiet for a moment, looking at lane 17. What happens to people like that? They keep working, Cross said. That's the thing about them. They just keep working. Maya fired. The round traveled 300 meters in the time it takes to form a thought and found the center of the target with the same authority it had found every target for 2.5 days. The same authority it would carry the next time and the time after that, because the authority didn't come from conditions or audience or the presence of witnesses. It came from somewhere that 19 years in one administrative dismissal And this entire morning had not been able to diminish by a single degree. She lowered her rifle, performed the safety procedures, collected her gear. She shouldered the worn green notebook for the last time on this range and walked the length of the firing line toward the exit. The operators who remained tracked her passage with the full attention that people give to someone whose true dimensions they have only recently understood, an attention that had been entirely absent 2.5 days ago when a figure with a contractor badge had taken position at lane 17 and nobody had thought to look twice. She did not acknowledge the attention, did not perform awareness of it or deflect it. She walked the way she had walked onto this range before 0500 on the first morning with the economy of motion that had characterized everything she had done here, each step exactly what it needed to be, and nothing more. Halverson moved to the gate as she reached it. He fell into step beside her for the last 20 yards, and they walked that distance together in the silence of two people who both know that what gets said in the remaining time will be what they carry. "I have to ask," he said, "one more time, who are you really?" She stopped at the gate. She turned and looked out past the facility's perimeter to the thin line of blue-gray Pacific at the edge of the California morning, enormous and patient and older than every institution that had ever tried to define what was possible. "In 2005, she said, someone told me the institution wasn't ready for someone like me. They said it with a reason code on a form, which is how institutions say things they don't want to be responsible for. I decided they were probably right. The institution wasn't ready." She paused. "I also decided that readiness was a condition you could build, that if the work was thorough enough and the record was complete enough and you were patient enough to wait for the moment when it all converged, the institution would have to be ready. Because the alternative would be choosing something worse on the record in front of witnesses." She turned to look at him. "That's who I am. Someone who decided that 19 years of building was worth one morning in Coronado." Halverson held the look. He was 29 years old and had 3 deployments and had understood since the second day that he was in the presence of something his vocabulary wasn't fully adequate for. Now he had the context the vocabulary required, and it was larger and longer and more patient than he had imagined. "Was it worth it?" he asked. She considered the question with the same seriousness she had brought to everything. "Ask me in 20 years, she said. She stepped through the gate. He watched her cross the parking area without looking back, her attention already forward, already on whatever came next. She reached the vehicle parked at the far edge of the lot, opened the door, paused for 1 second with her hand on the roof and her eyes on the middle distance. Then she got in. The door closed. The vehicle pulled out and turned north on the approach road, and the sound of it faded, and the gate stood open in the California morning light. And she was gone. Cross stood beside Halverson at the gate for a long moment after the vehicle had disappeared. The range behind them had begun its return to its ordinary function. The rangemaster was moving through the reset procedure clearing lanes, securing equipment, running through the end-of-session checklist. That was the same whether the session had been routine or whether it had ended with a federal relief of command. The facility continued. That was what facilities did. The individuals who passed through them left marks of varying depths, and then the work went on. Cross retired 8 months later on a February morning in a ceremony in the administrative building where Maya's contractor authorization had been processed before 0500 on a Tuesday. His citation mentioned 26 years of distinguished service. The people in the room stood and offered applause, and Cross received it with the expression of a man who is genuinely grateful for what he has been given and genuinely uncertain whether he has been given more than he earned. He went home to San Diego. He learned to use his mornings differently without the structure that 26 years had imposed. And in that unstructured time, he thought more clearly about things he had spent decades being too busy to examine. On certain mornings, when the light came through his kitchen window at the angle that reminded him of California dawns, on a range he would think about a question mark written in green ink in a worn notebook, and about the conversation that had followed, and about what she had said. This morning helped. He had decided eventually that this was the most honest verdict available. Not absolution, not condemnation. A point on a line that was still being drawn by him. One decision at a time in the time he had left to draw it. Ryan Caffrey's complaint was formally reopened and entered into the federal record 2 weeks after Coronado. It was the first of 7 similar documents the investigation surfaced and restored over the following 11 months. Caffrey was never present for the formal proceedings, which happened in conference rooms, in buildings he didn't have access to, conducted by people whose names he would never learn. But the complaint existed. It had his name on it and his dates in his account of what had happened, and it was in a system that had been audited at the federal level and was no longer maintained by people who owed anyone anything for its contents. He came to work differently after that, not loudly, more grounded. The way a structure is more stable when the thing undermining its foundation has been identified and removed. Sergeant Trent Halverson made senior chief 2 years ahead of the expected timeline. The promotion board's notes cited exceptional performance and in a phrase that required no elaboration for anyone who had been present that Wednesday morning in Coronado demonstrated integrity under institutional pressure. He never learned what Maya had written beside his name. He told himself it didn't matter. On most days, he believed that. Commander Dale Hurst's federal review concluded 14 months after Coronado. The findings were classified. The public record contained only the fact of the review and its disposition. His service record, which had contained a genuine citation for genuine courage at Ramadi in 2006, was amended. He was 52 years old. He had been a real hero once on a specific day under specific conditions that had asked the best of him and received it. That remained true. Nothing in any federal document could reach back to 2006 and revise what he had done there. But the record of what he had done since was also complete, now thorough and sourced, and entered into the permanent archive. The courage and the corruption of it existed in the same file, which is probably the most honest accounting a person can receive, and which is exactly what the work was designed to produce. He went home to Virginia and said very little about any of it. The worn green notebook remained in evidence, cataloged and preserved in a federal filing system that existed several clearance levels above anything appearing in an ordinary search. At the back on the last page with writing on it, there were names. Most had been resolved. Their question marks had been answered one way or another in the months following Coronado by what the people beside those names had done when the moment arrived and asked them who they were. A few remained open. The question marks beside those names were not verdicts. They were invitations. They meant the assessment and was ongoing that the notebook was patient and that the woman who carried it understood something that the institution had been slow to learn. That character is not a fixed condition any more than readiness is. It is a case being built one decision at a time toward a morning when it all converges. Somewhere the woman who had carried that notebook for 19 years was already building the next one. Not on that range, not with those people, but with the same quality of attention she had brought to Lane 17 before the sun came up over the Pacific, the same economy of motion, the same complete indifference to whether anyone was watching. She had never needed anyone to watch. The work itself had always been the point, not because it came without cost, not because it felt sufficient in the doing, but because it was the only thing she had ever found that moved the line and the line needed moving, and she was the one who had decided 19 years ago in the aftermath of an administrative dismissal that she was going to be the person who moved it. That decision had not been made in a moment of inspiration or certainty. It had been made in the quiet of someone sitting with the full weight of what had been done to her and asking herself the only question that mattered. What are you going to do with this? She had answered that question every day for 19 years in ranges, in briefing rooms, in federal case files, in a worn green notebook that had traveled with her through all of it. And on a Wednesday morning in Coronado with brass casings catching the California light and salt air coming in off the Pacific, the answer had been enough. It had moved the line. That was all the work had ever asked of her. That was everything.